Hello, Romantics. I'm Sarah Gomez, author, romance lover, and host. You're listening to Romancing the Story, a podcast centered around writing, reading, and story structure, all with a twist of romance. We're at episode 61, and on today's episode, writing instructor and multi-genre author Amber Royer chats all about animals. We discuss how animal companions can provide development and impact in a story. We laugh about pet personalities, quirks, and traits, along with the research that goes behind it. Plus, there's talk about the insistence that animals stay safe and well taken care of throughout the course of a book. Links to connect to Amber and her books, along with other book recommendations provided in the episode, will be listed in the description. So I have to confess a little something. This episode kind of came about by happenstance, but it kind of came around the same time that I took a quick little break away from the podcast. The reason being is because, speaking of animals, my dog decided one day that he was just gonna swallow a bone whole. So we ended up having to do emergency surgery, and after a hefty little vet bill and some time to rest, I am happy to report the chubby little guy is doing just fine. The only thing you can tell is that he has a little scar on his belly now. And that's something I really hope to include more of in my writing, is including pets. Since I know I'm not the only one, you guys probably have just as many quirky, funny stories about your own pets that you either have currently, or you grew up with, or you've had at some point in your life. And don't we all want to share stories like that? Now, since the autumn equinox is upon us and sweater weather is just around the corner, fingers crossed, I had to tell you of a cute online apparel shop for both writers and readers. It's called Amplifier Press Apparel. They create shirts and mugs designed with bookish people in mind. Whether you want to chill for a nighttime reading or gear up for writing sprints, Amplifier Press has a design that expresses your personality. I personally like the I Write My Own Love Stories t-shirt. But Amplifier Press is adding new designs every week. Use the special discount code of WELCOME15 for your first order for 15% off, and enjoy lounging in apparel designed by writers, for writers, and readers. I will include an affiliate link and the code in the description if you're interested. With that said, let's jump right in. Welcome, author and writing instructor, Amber Royer. Yay! You know, you're one of our favorite guests around the podcast. But in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your writing?
So I'm Amber Royer. I've been a creative writing instructor since 2008, former librarian. I'm the author of the Bean to Bar Mysteries. Here's the one that just came out on Tuesday. So this is Something Borrowed, Something 90% Dark. It's the 6th one in the series, and each one has featured a different animal companion that my character gets to hang out with. I'm also the author of the Chocolaverse trilogy, which does have a couple of cute and cuddly animals in it as well, especially the corgi. Everybody loved the corgi. And I also have a writer's workbook and a cookbook involving chocolate, because just about everything I write, you can guess from the titles, has something to do with chocolate.
Well, and you were just like, weren't you a guest at the chocolate festival?
Sander was awesome. He let me moderate one of the classrooms. So that was doing intros for all the people who were bringing in their samples and talking about different regions where the chocolate is grown. There's one chocolate maker I've actually gotten to interview virtually because I met her through the chocolate festival. And I got to meet her in person for the first time because she lives in Brazil.
That's incredible. And I know you've done so much like research and really put a lot of work and effort into like figuring out how to write about chocolate and what like goes into the chocolate making process. So it isn't just like, oh yeah, I write about chocolate because I like chocolate. Like you've really like done a lot of research and like I said, just really deep diving into that world and that kind of, I mean, it's just, you have such a love for it. You can see it. And I love seeing all your pictures and all these places you get to go.
I think what fascinates me about it is all of these people's stories of reinvention. And when I did the Chocolateverse books, that was originally kind of a lark. And we had been on a cruise. I was lecturing. I had met Art from Amano Chocolate back when craft chocolate was barely a thing. And it had taken off. There were 2 or 3 chocolate festivals, and I was doing lectures for Royal Caribbean when they had those enrichment lectures. But Art gave me some craft chocolate samples to do a chocolate tasting. And it was interesting seeing people's reaction and how some of them just really embraced it. And they're like, oh, this is like wine with a terroir, and you can really taste the differences. And this one's smoky and that one's fruity, and, you know, all of that. Versus about half the audience was like, this doesn't taste like chocolate. This isn't what I think of when I think of chocolate. And some of them wouldn't even try it because it was like outside their comfort zone. It's a lot more common now because everybody's gotten used to the idea and of craft chocolate being a thing. Then on that same trip, we went to a cacao plantation and actually met the farmers. And so all of that was rattling around in my brain. Anybody who's not familiar with National Novel Writing Month, it was approaching, and it's this laughable idea that you're going to write a 50,000 word novel in a month, which is more a novella. Being the writer group leader, I had to have a project and I had to do it. And I just came up with this fanciful, okay, well, what if the cacao pod, it kind of looks like a Nerf football? What if it's kind of like a football and everybody wants it? And there's a couple of scenes where people are like throwing it across the room, and if it hits the floor, it's going to shatter, and you know, all this kind of stuff. But when you look at craft chocolate and it not being a thing 10 years ago, nobody grew up saying, I want to be a craft chocolate maker. Art from Amano, I was actually talking to him this weekend. He majored in archaeology and then became an engineer. So he had reinvented himself twice to become a chocolate maker. And most everybody you talk to has a story like that. It's like something happened and I went for a weekend and blah, 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 and bam, I'm interested in chocolate. And I think a lot of us fall into our expertise or what we tend to write about sort of like that, sort of by accident. And then it becomes something we're known for. And all of a sudden you got to work to be an expert in it because you're already known for it. But you have an interest, so that's okay.
And I love how chocolate has kind of taken a part, like a really important part in each of your stories now, it seems like, going forward, which is really fascinating to me and always fun. You did mention you had a brand new book just released from the Bean to Bar Cozy Mysteries, right? Series. Yay.
Make it not disappear off camera.
That is something we talked about actually last time you were here, was the cozy mysteries, and like kind of what were the hallmarks and what kind of makes a cozy mystery really cozy. And one of the things you mentioned, and something we want to talk about today, is kind of the sidekicks, right? The animal sidekicks and or the kind of the pets, right? That kind of go along as that kind of that piece of the cozy mystery. So you make a concerted effort to choose different types of animals. I love that. I love that you go beyond kind of the standard cat and dog that we might see in a series, and you kind of go to the obscure and amazing, like the octopus, and the one you just released is a goat, right? Each book really highlights the individual animal's traits. How do you choose which type of animal would make the most sense for your story?
Part of it is what you need the animal to do in the story. And part of it is just the opportunity to get to show how difficult it might be to care for some of these animals. For instance, goats are noisy and they are group animals. So you have this very needy goat who has been separated from her group, and then my character winds up in charge of her. There's this whole thing where she's lost, so it becomes part of the plot. She kind of destroys the place where she got left when they finally find her, because that's what goats do. And she eats part of the clue because it's on paper. There is a myth that goats will eat anything. They'll taste anything. They will eat paper, But most other things, they're just trying to get a feel for it, and they'll usually spit it out. But I wanted that whole, she got part of the file, and there was only the bits left the goat didn't eat, and the goat couldn't tell her what happened. I kind of play with that, and then where does that lead me as far as what can happen in the plot? Well, goats like to climb, so there's going to be some climbing involved, and it has to kind of snowball so that there's a reason it's that particular animal.
Well, and I love that you add like a little drama with it, right? Because the goat eats like part of the clue. Because like it's not just like a background character. You're kind of like just like, oh yeah, he's an active participant and now he's like kind of important.
It's like the octopus. I started out with the idea that it would humanize my character who had gone missing, and he would almost be a stand-in for him. And so Felicity winds up getting tasked to go to her employee's apartment and take care of the fish and the octopus. And when she gets there, the octopus is in the wrong tank. But the octopus obviously has started to miss his human. And so him being there gives Felicity a chance to really think about who Mateo was without Mateo actually being present. So I wanted something that would require her to put in a bit of effort and also be something that has a lot of personality. And octopuses are little troublemakers. We went in Hawaii. They call it an octopus farm, but it's a marine research facility. You get to interact with them, and you can feed them, and you can play with them. And when you walk in, they're like, any shinies you need to be really careful of. If a 3-year-old can take it off of you, they probably can too. I have my GoPro and I have my wrist strap on it. Thank goodness, or I never would have seen that thing again. And Jake was intentionally playing with his watch and the octopus, and every time he would move the shiny part of his watch, the octopus would kind of reach for it and he'd move it out of the way. And so I'm trying to capture this on film, because you know me, I film everything. And I start to put my GoPro kind of down into the water, and all of a sudden the octopus changes color. And that's the cool thing about them. I originally got interested when I saw a video of octopuses dreaming, and it shows how they change color when they dream. They also change color a lot more than you think. It noticed my GoPro and it completely changed color, and then it changed color again to match the rock. It went behind the rock, and then all of a sudden, with the recording I got, you just see this arm coming out from behind the rock, and it kind of engulfs the GoPro. And so I didn't want to hurt the poor thing, and I'm like trying to hold the camera, and I've got 3 arms on the camera and 2 on my wrist, and the octopus is trying to pull it off, and Jake's trying to get him extricated from it. And they're also kind of Houdinis of the ocean. And I played with that also. I have a bird, and cockatoos are Houdinis of the bird world. So I wanted this bird to constantly be getting out and getting into places where he shouldn't be, so that he could be the bird who saw too much. And you really have to think, what is the role of the animal in the story? What do I want to do with it? But I also like to highlight animal care, because people do get ideas that, oh, it would be great to have a pet octopus. Oh, it would be great to have a pet goat and have my little apartment farm, basically. And people do keep goats indoors, but it's a great deal of work. People do properly keep octopuses, but if you don't, it's like having a 3-year-old in the house. And if you leave them without enough to do, they're going to become resentful, they're going to become angry, and they're often wind up in tanks that are too small and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of become a pattern. It started with the first book. I made it canon that Knightley's a rescue. And that made Felicity more sympathetic, because not only does she have a bunny, which is an animal that's, you know, kind of cuddly but kind of shy, and she understands Knightley, but Knightley's been through some stuff. And so she winds up taking care of him on that level, understanding that he's been through some stuff. And so then you get Clive, and Clive was probably returned to a pet store, because people will get something like an octopus and realize that it's a lot more work than they wanted. And then when you get to Renoir, who's a bird who has an exceptionally long lifespan, I gave him a really tragic backstory. I feel kind of bad about him. So I gave him an elderly owner that had had him since he was little, who winds up getting a ride from somebody out of town who won't take the bird. And so he lives through Hurricane Ike, which is pretty devastating for him to have been left alone for several days and things like that. But that plight really did happen to a lot of animals who people just couldn't find a way to get them off the island. So I kind of come into it with Felicity being this person who needs to care for people, but she feels a little bit isolated because she starts the series as a widow. And so by giving her these animals that obviously have sympathetic backstories that she can uncover, it makes her think harder about people. And she starts to realize that the people around her also have pain that they're hiding. And it helps her be a better detective, but she's also growing as a person and realizing she hasn't always been the best friend in the past. And I'm using the animal companions for a purpose on that character development level.
That is such a great way to kind of integrate them into a, like, more than just like a sidekick, right? Just kind of a side character as actually part of, like, it's telling something about the story itself, whether it's the main plot, the subplot, or even a little bit of like development as far as the world itself. Like, what's a common pitfall though you see, since sidekicks are, the pets and animal sidekicks are such a big part of like the cozy mystery genre in particular, what's a common pitfall that you usually see?
Well, I think it's forgetting they're there when it's inconvenient. I ran into that with Logan. Logan has a foster dog that he picked up in book 5. He did it reluctantly because he's got so many places that he travels and so many things that he does. Now he's got this dog. Felicity meets up with him and they have to go to a place that has a dog friendly patio if they're going to bring the dog. So he wound up leaving it at home because he wasn't sure she'd want to do that. And so he comes back and the dog almost immediately has an accident. And, things like that happen. But if you write an animal that is cute and cuddly and there, but never has to be fed or never gets in the way, or you don't have to arrange a puppy sitter if you're gone for 2 days, it starts to feel like it's not a real character. And those complications add a level of depth, because now you have Logan who's happy-go-lucky and he's got a responsibility he's never had before. And so it helps develop him in that way as well. But you don't want the cat that just, we've been gone for 2 weeks. Hi, cat, you're there. And you also don't want to go the other extreme, because if you have scenes that have nothing to do with your plot, that are just showing off how cute the animal is, that's going to slow down your story, especially if it's got a lot of working parts, because my cozy mysteries also have romance subplots and community building subplots. And so I don't have room as far as word count to have just, oh, here's a scene where we play with the bird and the bird is cute and maybe everybody chatters about stuff. If we play with the bird and the bird is cute, the bird has to say something that's a clue. There's got to be a purpose to that scene. And I know my animal characters sometimes do tend to steal the show, but if they do it, it's almost a misdirect, so that something important is going on and my character's attention is divided. And so the whatever is important kind of like slides by and then she comes back to it.
That's a great thing to take in consideration, because that's something that I'm trying, because I want to add, like, so badly, a little animal to one of my novels. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, when is it important that they be in a scene and when is it important that they don't be in a scene, right? Like you said, just kind of like where that focus is at any given time, because they can be cute, but we don't want to be like, they're like you said, stealing the show. And I love all animals, but I figured a dog's pretty safe because I know enough about dogs, at least, right? It wouldn't be too much of a jump. And I thought it might be an easy place to start.
And if you're doing something where it's a mystery, dogs tend to sniff out stuff. Dogs can find things. Dogs can bury things. So there's all kinds of ways the dog can come into play doing plot stuff. I was going to bring Eddie from Frasier up a little bit later. But if you think about it, that dog showed the true nature of every character in the story, because everybody's reaction to it. You've got the dad who loves it, Frasier who really wants it out of his house. Niles comes in, and how does he relate to the dog? It shows how he relates to Frasier. Daphne is sweet to the dog. And so we see that she has a sweet side. So if you're going to have the dog there and the dog isn't doing something plot wise, can the dog get a reaction from the human characters that shows something important about what's going on in the story? That scene where they come home to Logan's dog and the dog is like not been walked, I make that comic, so that it relieves some of the tension that's going on in the scene. So if you're going to put the dog there, it shouldn't be just like, and there was a cute dog. There was a real dog, and the dog caused problems. The dog introduced people. My friends just got a puppy. Random people stopped to talk about the puppy. Random small children came up to hug the puppy. And it was adorable, and it was an icebreaker. So if you need your character to meet some people, give them a dog and have them go through the neighborhood. People will want to pet the dog, talk about the dog, feed the dog, and that can segue into other conversations.
Right. And like you said, like animals can add a lot of depth to stories through their own personalities and relationships they have with other characters. So
Yeah.
specifically in your Bean to Bar series, not only are the animals cute and fun, they help solve murders too. So when writing a pet, I always worry that like they'll become background noise, kind of like I mentioned. I don't know if I don't want to put too much focus on it, but I don't want them to be forgotten either. So what should authors consider when writing pets who contribute to the plot or character development?
Well, if you're afraid of them becoming background noise, you can actually kind of do a search for the pet's name. And does that name, I don't know which software you prefer, but I use Word and I set up chapters. So when I look at it on Word, every time that character's name shows up in a chapter, it's going to gray out that bar showing that it's here, 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 and here. Do you have a huge stretch of your book where it's not got that mark that the character is in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can make sure that you're checking in with the animal reasonably frequently, because you don't want to introduce a cool element and then have somebody going, hey, whatever happened to so and so? And that includes the pets, because people will worry about the pets. Have they been fed? Have they been walked? Are they destroying the apartment? Depending on the type of animal it is. A cat, people are probably not going to worry about if you don't check in with him all day. But a dog, people will be like, oh, she didn't have anybody take care of her dog. And so if you're going to write the dog out because you need to go do something, one sentence saying that you asked so and so to check in on your dog, will often satisfy readers. They're also concerned with what the animals are eating. So if you're giving the animal treats, readers will sometimes. I've talked to other mystery authors, and they're like, yeah, they commented that I gave the pet too many treats, and this can't be good for their health. And so people like to think of them as real, and to create the illusion that they are real, they need to be present in that way. Even if they're not in the scene, we've taken care of them. There was a scene at the end of one of the books where Felicity is with one of the dog characters. She's with Satchmo, and she has to go run off and save a character who's in danger. And there were a bunch of police officers there, and B was on site. So B is Satchmo's owner. One of my readers looking at the draft was like, I enjoyed everything about this book except at the end where you abandoned Satchmo at a crime scene. And I'm like, well, all the police officers were there. He was fine. So I had to go back and write in, and she found B and gave Satchmo's leash. And then she ran off and saved the character. Because people will notice the incontinuity of it. And the fact that is an inconvenience can often be played either for humor or for tension, or just to ground it in reality.
I always do. I always check like in movies or TV series, I check that website, does the dog die? Because I can't, like, I got to know that the dog's going to be okay. Like, I know, and I know like directors, like probably authors too, now that you mention it, but I know like directors have gone out on record after the fact when people are like, we saw the dog like halfway through the film. Is the dog okay?
Yeah. And you can do awful things to human characters, but
all day long.
It's a trope, right? You save cat, and if you save the cat, that means you're a good guy. And so when you give somebody a literal save the cat moment where they help a cat out of the tree, like in Groundhog's Day, that's one of his big emotional breakthroughs, is he literally saves a cat. And then there's other times where people will rescue an animal. So Frank got his save the cat in the Chocoverse by rescuing both us. It became important and it humanized him as a character. And we could see that he could have a character arc because of that. Now, the corollary to that is if you kick the dog, and you never want to do that because it's really hard to come back from. Kicking the dog means that you have done something unnecessarily cruel, and it's to an innocent. And a dog is the absolute most innocent character you can come up with because he's going to love you no matter what. Even if you're a bad guy, the dog is going to be loyal. And so kicking the dog is a sign you're irredeemably bad. So playing with that as character development, it can either sympathize a person or it can make us really recognize that they're irredeemable. We shouldn't be expecting them to get a redemption arc. And you were talking earlier about how you want to make sure the animal is safe. I'm going to spoiler Turner and Hooch for anybody who hasn't seen a 20-some-odd-year-old movie. I saw an interview with Tom Hanks once where he said that the only thing he really regretted in his entire career was killing Hooch, because so many people connected with him and his journey, and going from someone who didn't understand connection to having a connection with his dog. And they tried to play it off as, okay, well, here's the next generation with the puppies and honor and memory and all of that. But people were mad because Hooch was a beloved character. He was this big, drooly, slobbering, literal underdog. And if you have a character like that, you want to make sure that we feel safe getting connected to such a character. Because if we feel like something might happen to that character, we don't relate in the same way and we don't connect on the same level.
Like, I could almost justify, like, oh, yeah, that other person, okay, he killed him, big deal. But like an animal, that's where I draw a line.
True in a lot of genres. I mean, if you want to show somebody's completely irredeemable in an action thing or a romance, you have to be cold towards an animal. But if you want to show that even, this action hero is going to have an arc, you let him save a cat or save a dog or, anything that shows that they can have empathy towards someone's plight.
And when utilizing pets and animal sidekicks, you allow the animals to contribute to the story in a meaningful way as like an actual character in the story, kind of what we've been talking about. And like, I know you kind of mentioned like you can use them to add tension or take tension away even, right? In certain scenes. Of course, my natural inclination is to favor an animal in a scene, but working on it. How can we develop sidekick animals and to fully realize characters with personality that emphasizes instead of detracting from the story?
Again, it comes down to them having a purpose in the story. So there's somebody we both know, Diane Kelly, who writes a House Flipper series, and her House Flipper series alternates chapters with her human characters and then Sawdust the cat. And Sawdust's big nemesis is the vacuum cleaner. And so he's got his own perspective and his own little life going on. And he feels like he's a coward and that he needs to learn how to protect his owner. And that if he can defeat this nemesis and stand up and all of this. And in the course of the first book, he does wind up protecting her. He has an actual character arc. And because of that, when we see him in the subsequent books, it's like he's grown, he's changed. He feels like a fully realized character. And so I think the key is either treat the character as a sounding board and, okay, this is an animal and it's more like Eddie and the effects that Eddie has, because Eddie, he is a dog and he's going to do what dogs do. And that's where the plot keeps him, right? Or you treat this as another character on the same level as a human character, own desires, on wants, on backstory, so that when we look at it, it's like okay, there are 5 people in the room and 1 dog. You have 6 characters to juggle, you know? So you think of it on that level. Is this character, when they're on the page, going to be an important part of the scene? Then you need to think about, okay, with your human characters, usually you've developed them to the point where if something happens, you know how they're going to react. So if you know a pet you've had, well, if something happens, you know how they're going to react. Even my friend's new puppy, they've only had him for like 4 or 5 months, but you know how he's going to react if you chastise him for chewing on things. He's part Australian Shepherd, so knowing that the breed is super hyper, you can imagine when you come in exactly how he's going to react. You take him to the park. How far are you going to get? How fast? How likely is he going to be to get into trouble? You know, because you know that particular animal. And I think if you haven't interacted with one or haven't owned one, talking to somebody who has can really help. Like for me, when I was a kid, we did occasionally raise rabbits, but that was more, that was outside in a hutch and all of that kind of stuff. It wasn't something where you could have a personal connection with it. So it wasn't until I met my friend's bunny. So Yuki was definitely the model for Nightly. And I'm like, oh, you have the bunny hopping around inside the house. And that's novel. And then I realized there's a whole thing of rabbit care, and you can connect to them, and they're not just, the animals that happen to be on your property. They're animals that can show love, and you can really bond with a rabbit. And their rabbit was so sweet. Unfortunately, Yuki passed away, and that made me very sad. So the last 2 books have had a dedication to him, because he really did inspire Nightly and really helped me figure out the connection between Felicity and Nightly. Even though it wasn't my experience as a child, when we basically were 4-H style, raising rabbits. And it was just such a sweet thing. And I think that translates into the warmth in the book. And also, there's some stuff in the first book where there's a hurricane coming in and there's an evacuation. Well, bunnies get really stressed. They don't like being far from the floor. So if you have them in a carrier and you put the carrier on the floor, they're okay. But if you have them up like high, it's not where they naturally want to be. And so they will have tons of anxiety and all of that. So it really helped write the scene to have the anxiety in the humans, because they're having to take care of the bunny and see how the bunny is reacting, right? And then there's a scene where Felicity gets to show that she can have joy after all of the sorrow in her life. And bunnies do this thing called binking, where they just randomly race across the room and leap, because they really are athletes. And so I have a scene where I play it for humor a little bit because somebody walks in, but she's kind of binking with the bunny, and it's pure unbridled joy that comes from knowing how these animals really do behave.
Well, and you talk about like animal personalities, like that's something that I've kind of been like really, especially since I want to write an animal into my story, I've been kind of more hyper aware of, and that's something that was that I've noticed more frequently about my dog. One of my dogs grew up with my cat. And so I think she thinks she's cat. Like, and I guess I really just never noticed it because I just thought it was her. And our daughter now, was our foster kiddo, and now we took her on full time. She's our daughter. Yay. I know, I'm so excited. But she pointed out, because she used to have cats, she's like, that dog acts like a cat. And she does. She rubs around if she wants attention, she'll rub around your leg. And I think that's because we got her as a puppy when she was like 8 weeks old, and she only grew up with my cat. So she really never saw how dogs interacted with each other. She only knew the cat. So it's so interesting how like different environments can kind of create their own personalities, right? The animals can have their own very own personalities.
And I think that would be a fun quirk to write into a story, because I've seen like videos where, okay, the kitten thinks she's a bunny, and so she's trying to hop like her bunny sister, or whatever. But I haven't seen that in the story. I think that would be adorable. It's like he acts like a cat and everybody notices.
And like maybe the owner is just like oblivious because that's always been the case, right?
Yeah. She's supposed to act like a cat. I raised her with cats, duh.
Right, exactly. We always say she has an identity crisis. She doesn't know what she is. So
See how you can play that for humor, and that makes it a very distinct character.
I know on the podcast, we talk about a lot about goals and motivations in context to like character creation, and as kind of, animal lover myself, I tend to theorize motives of my own animals' behaviors, kind of like the dog that thinks she's a cat. And so should authors give animal sidekicks their own motives and challenges to overcome aside from the protagonist?
I think it really depends on how much focus you want to put on the animal.
Fair.
Because a character like Sawdust having the nemesis of the vacuum cleaner, Sawdust having those kind of goals, that's one way to use a character. And he had his own chapters. He had his own fully developed subplot in each book. And that's one level of animal character. I mean, with cozies, you have some that are entirely narrated by the animal. I think we mentioned it last time, the Chet and Bernie series. So Chet's POV on Bernie is everything, because Bernie is a deadbeat detective. He's not a great guy. If we were in Bernie's point of view for half of what's going on, it would be less than noble. But because Chet thinks everything his owner does is amazing, it's a completely different book. And then you actually have that whole dog side of things where, okay, I'm paying attention. This is what's going on. But, oh, there's a rabbit over here, and that is interesting. Or, oh, there's another dog, and now I've got to have a conflict over here with this other dog. And maybe I miss part of what's going on over here so that there's more suspense later in the story. And so that is definitely a fully realized character with his own goals and problems and all of that. But then you dial it back a little bit. And if you look at something like the Cat Who mysteries, are you familiar with these ones? Lily and Jackson Braun. Okay, so in the first book, the guy doesn't have cats. So he takes a job. He's hit rock bottom. So he had an alcohol addiction, lost his job, his wife left over it. And so he's taken this last ditch thing. He's a reporter. He was on the crime beat. His friend from college, when he was, learning what he was doing, is the head of the newspaper in a town they call Pickaxe 50 miles north of everywhere. And so he's moving into the middle of nowhere with no connections. And in the course of the first case, he winds up saddled with a cat that he never wanted. But of course, the cat saved his life and it belonged to the murder victim, all this kind of stuff. So he forms a connection. The cat sort of has its own thing going on, but Coco has this, I'm trying to remember how they put it because it's been a while. But he has a yowl that's a particular yowl that signals that something bad has happened. And so by about 5 or 6 books in, Quillerin, when he knows Coco's particular yowl, he knows that something is up. And it's never in Coco's point of view that, oh, I'm going to show you a clue, but he tends to uncover clues in a way that Quillerin almost thinks is intentional. And then you get the second cat, Yum Yum, and there's a dynamic between the two because Coco is this big dominant male cat and Yum Yum is a smaller female cat, and they're developed to that degree, but they're not developed hugely. And then you have the level of Asta from The Thin Man. And I've been thinking a lot about The Thin Man since it was the grounding book for this cozy mystery. In each of these, not only has Felicity been interacting with a different animal, but she's got her own yowl in that every time she gets a rare book, she knows that something bad is going to happen and she doesn't like this. So like when in the third book, somebody tries to give her this copy of this illustrated manuscript of Treasure Island. She's like, oh, but no, please keep it. And they're like, no, you must have it. She's like, oh man. So in this one, she winds up with a copy of The Thin Man that the character who was murdered is a kleptomaniac and has borrowed a lot of things from around town and given them to different people. Because Felicity doesn't want to take any more old books. She just winds up with it in front of her. Like, how the heck did this happen? And it's a copy of The Thin Man. And Asta was so popular in the movies. Have you seen the Thin Man movies with William Powell, Myrna Loy?
I've heard of them.
Okay.
And I think I've seen little pieces of them, but I haven't like actually watched the full movie.
Okay, if you want to study comic timing and banter, especially if you contrast the book with the movie, because the book was written by a guy who had a rocky relationship and on again, off again kind of thing. And so he wrote this couple who are married. And I think that the people who did the script for the film, because they were a married couple, there's warmth in the movie relationship and in the banter that's more sharp and just humorous in the book. And so Asta in the book it's their dog, and he was a different breed of dog. I think he was a Schnauzer in the book, but he's a wire hair terrier in the movie. And he became such a beloved character that whole breed fell prey to overbreeding for a while because everybody wanted their own Asta. And Asta does not have his own goals or desires. His desire is to be a dog. And his emotional response to what's going on is what makes him a good character. So it's like they'll be bantering and he's just like, hey, and then something happens. And then they would have the dog do that thing where he like covers his face with one paw. Like, oh my God, this isn't really happening. Or it becomes a real sounding board for characters who are often alone. Like in the big climactic scene in the first movie, you have a character going into a building alone and figuring out from what he sees, I don't want to spoil the whole thing, what really happened, and nobody's there with him except the dog. So of course he can talk to the dog, and the dog's like, you know, and it's the facial expressions, which movies, right?
Yeah.
They get facial expressions, they get music. We have to describe these things. But so rather than have the dog be a huge part in that way where, you know, I've got my own subplot and what do I think about my owner and all that kind of stuff, you just have the dog be there to warm up the scenes and to be a sounding board for ideas and kind of a mediator between this couple, because they're like bantering, and then you cut to the dog and you see the dog's reaction between the two, and it shows that they both have a common interest.
And I think that's a great like way to kind of like endear those characters to the audience, or kind of like see them how their struggle is, right? When you kind of isolate them and show them like one-on-one with an animal, you know, because sometimes we imprint or kind of project our own personality or our own struggles on the dog. So like I know sometimes I talk through my own dog.
Yeah, and sometimes you narrate for the dog. Go back to Tom Hanks and think about Castaway. It wasn't an animal. What did he have? He had a
volleyball.
And the volleyball served the same purpose. It was a sounding board. And I don't know about you, the first time I watched that movie, when the volleyball drifts away and he is truly alone, I cried over the volleyball because it meant that much to the character. So sometimes the animal is important in itself and it's got its own plot, but sometimes it's the meaning of the animal to your protagonist or to whatever characters are interacting with it.
So like you bring up like Wilson, the volleyball from Castaway, and I know that we can sometimes do things that are a little bit outside of our wheelhouse, right? Sometimes we use, like you have used like different types of animals, kind of like we were saying in the beginning. What kind of research went into creating animal characters that may or may not be in our wheelhouse, especially ones like you mentioned, like Knightley the bunny or Clive the octopus or Renoir the cockatoo?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to research. If it's not an animal that you've cared for before, and some of that can be hands-on, like with Princess Buttercup, I had a lot of ideas of what goats were, but I wasn't really sure. And the whole idea came about, we were in Hawaii. I was researching coffee. And so we tasted a bunch of chocolate that was local to Hawaii with Hawaii grown ingredients. And one of them was a goat milk chocolate bar. And when I tasted that bar, I was like, I know I've got to work this in somehow. And then on that same trip, we wound up at a goat dairy and we tasted goat milk caramel. And I was like, okay, I know I want to work this into the story, but I didn't know a whole lot about goat behavior. So I started doing some research and watching some YouTube videos. And then we were looking for local goat cheese once we got home. So I met a guy at the Salina night market who had a goat dairy just north of McKinney. We live in McKinney, so he was maybe 25 minutes out into the country. And he let us tour the place and watch him milk the goats and showed us all the processes of making cheese. And all of that kind of went into the story. And when we met the goats at the goat dairy in Hawaii, you were allowed to feed them because they were little baby goats. And when we saw them at the goat dairy here, they were full-size adults. And I'm like, okay, for the purposes of this story, I want them to be the size of the little baby goats. So I looked into it, and you do still get milk from the pygmy goats, but they're a lot less unwieldy as far as a character who would be moving around or something that would be kept as a pet. And I was talking to the guy in Salina about, okay, I've been highlighting pets and I've heard that people keep goats as pets, but these are obviously livestock. And he's like, yeah, some people will put diapers on them and keep them in the house. So there's definitely an option. It's just a lot more work to keep one as a pet as opposed to keeping it with a number of goats where it can socialize amongst themselves. So another thing I learned was that if you have a group of goats, you're probably going to have either all females, which makes more sense for a dairy, or they'll be separated from the males because there's a lot of aggression and problems with, all of that kind of stuff. And so I definitely wanted to have a nanny goat. And the big problem was going to be if they didn't find her, she needed to be milked. It's very uncomfortable for a goat not to be milked every day. And so the longer she's missing, the more uncomfortable she is, and the more likely she is to have some sort of health impact. So it gave a ticking clock. And that's from, learning about the actual behavior and physiology of goats. And I was talking to one person, and they said, ideally, they'd be milked twice a day. That's a whole level of complication my characters are not prepared for. And I did some of the research, but when we saw the milking at the facility, it was, okay, goat is hooked up to machine and gets milked. And I really didn't want to have a scene in my book where I go through the very logistics of all of that. And so basically I gloss over it with, we found the goat, we need to milk the goat. How do we milk the goat? Felicity pulls out her phone and watches a YouTube video and says, that's straightforward. And then we cut to the next scene. Because if you have something where it's not going to be necessary to your story, it's okay to just gloss over parts of the animal care.
Like you said, you maybe not have experience and it's not like pertinent to the story, like that pertinent to the story. It adds a time, like you said, a ticking clock, but it's not like do we really need a whole scene of her milking the goat?
We do not.
See, exactly. So it's important to know when it is, like you said, pertinent to the story versus when it's not.
And, there's animals that you would want to have if you had the time or the space, and you get to live vicariously through that. Because I would love to have an octopus, but do I have the time to take care of one? I would love to have one of the larger birds, but you know how much care goes into it. Mm-hmm. We had cockatiels for a little while, and the cleaning up after them was amazing because they would throw things around out of their cage and stuff. The larger birds require even more time and attention. We wound up giving the cockatiels to a family that really, really wanted them. Their children were in love with the birds, and we, were both at the time working full time. And I'm like, okay, well, if they're going to be there and home all day, it's probably better. So sometimes you in your own life, you have to match the pets that you can have. So I'm more cat speed than dogs because I love dogs. But the idea of walking one at 7 in the morning is just a little overwhelming for me.
Mhm.
But they both make great pets. And it's like my friend's dog, I love going over there and playing with it. At the current time, I don't have the energy for a dog, and I love living vicariously through her and seeing all the pictures of hers and getting to walk hers and, all of that. I definitely don't have the time or energy that it takes for a macaw, which is the bird that I love the most, which is not the bird that wound up in the book. It was a cockatoo because cockatoos are Houdinis, and
Mm.
macaws are a little more chill. And I wanted one that was a little more hyper, back to the breed specific personality of dogs or whatever. Birds are the same way. So there's a lot of living vicariously and opportunities for research. I mean, why else would I have ever gone out to a goat farm and just spent an afternoon hanging out with the baby goats? It gives you a reason to learn things, which I always love. I uncover new things about whatever animal I'm wanting to work with, especially looking into like the abilities of dogs to sniff out certain things and all that. I did quite a bit of research, probably more than was needed for the 3 scenes in my cozy mystery. But then I felt like I really knew how that worked and was able to write Satchmo and his abilities more naturally.
Well, and honestly, research or not, I will use any excuse to be around animals.
Or there's animals you aren't sure about. Like yesterday, I did a Facebook takeover, and everybody was talking about their favorite unique animals that they've seen in books. But people were also telling me about their pets, and one of them was talking about a pet ferret. And I'm like, oh, that would be fun to work into a book because from what I've heard, ferrets like to hoard shiny objects. And so I can imagine a ferret stealing an important clue. And so the first thing that I did when I got off that call was I went and I looked up, is this a true thing? Or is this something I've just heard? And yes, they do like shiny objects. They're like magpies. And I'm like, okay, well, don't be surprised if there's either a chicken or a ferret or possibly a miniature horse in the next book. I'm working on it.
I love it. So I look forward to like your next writing venture to see what kind of animal might be included, right?
The book that's going to be in the series next, the title's going to be A Chocolate is Announced. And she's going to announce a new product. And I know, playing off of A Murder is Announced, that I want to have it at a murder mystery dinner and then things turn real. But I haven't figured out a lot of the other logistics. I just have the overarching plot. And so I'm like, okay, what really is going to fit in with that? And I haven't got a good answer yet, but I'm brainstorming.
Who doesn't love a good murder mystery? And then the real murder's real on top of it. We have talked so much about all these amazing ideas for like how to incorporate animals and pets and, the furry sidekicks into our writing. So where can listeners find your books and how can they connect with you?
Okay, so my website, amberroyer.com. I am very active on Instagram and Facebook. If you're interested in writing at all, I do also have a Saturday night write session once a month, and you can find out about that through the Facebook group. You can also connect with other writers, mostly local to DFW, but not entirely, since Facebook and doing things virtually has opened us up. We have members from all over. My books are available wherever books are sold because I'm hybrid, so my traditionally published stuff obviously is going to be able to be found on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all of that. And even my indie stuff we went through Ingram so that it would also be orderable from bookstores. So if there is an indie bookstore you like, you can order any of my work.
Thanks so much to Amber for joining the show. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. That way you're the first to hear new episodes when they drop. And if you get a chance, feel free to leave a review. It helps support the show and allows more opportunity to bring in all kinds of fantastic guests. There's also a link to the YouTube channel in the description if you'd like to see the interviews with some of the guests and see them show off their lovely books. Book recommendations for this episode: Something Borrowed, Something 90% Dark by Amber Royer, and Dead as a Doorknocker by Diane Kelly. As always, stay safe, be well, and keep writing. Bye!